This program is brought to you by Emory University.
So, Anne, thank you. So nice to see you here. And it's so lovely to have your exhibition here at Emory, as I've told you, and as I think many people have told me. And this is just such a privilege. I want to just start by thanking you again for coming here and bringing your work and sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom and resources and stories with us. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Jason, it's such a pleasure for me to be here on two fronts. One, personally, because I've loved every minute I've spent at Emory, but on a second level, because wherever these photos are seen, these individuals have a chance to be known again. And at Emory, the reception has been so beautiful and so enthusiastic and so deep that I feel as if they, the people in the pictures, and I could not imagine a warmer welcome. Thank you.
I want to start by asking you about the nature of your work, not just as a photographer, but as a collector of stories, and beyond a collector of stories, as a creator of stories or a recreator of stories, because I think that this is really at the center of the creative practice, as I understand it, that you've developed. In other words, it would be wrong to call you just a researcher. It would be wrong to call you an archivist. It would be wrong to. Your book is much more than that, and you've taken on a responsibility to create, in a sense, to create biographies and to create stories and a sense of realness about a world that wouldn't happen just by looking at the photographs themselves. And so I guess I want to ask you, first of all, whether this intuition that I have is actually correct, and if so, what is it for you to begin the process of finding characters in stories that hover around photographs?
And not just hover around photographs, but hover around these photographs. Because what makes these archival photographs so different than any others is that the people are not here to tell their own stories. The people never got a chance to live their lives in full measure. The people who lived normal lives did the things that you and I do. It was all cut abruptly short, not because they did some terrible crime, but because the blood in their veins was Jewish blood, and that was considered life unworthy of life. Your question, although I've been interviewed by so many people, is one I've never been asked before, because I've never been interviewed by a fellow photographer, an artist, and person who sees beneath the surface. You asked a lot of questions.
I guess I did. I asked several questions,
so
rolled up into one question. That's my bad habit.
I'm going to try to answer sort of in a composite form, but if I've left out anything, you'll pick up the loose thread that I forgot. One of the parts that every part of what you asked, by the way, I felt, because it showed that the magnitude of what this project entailed wasn't just copying the photos, although I shouldn't minimize the copying of photos years and years before we had anything like digital cameras was a very laborious process, and I had to be taught. I had somebody, a professional photographer who dealt with archival photos in Philadelphia, where we have lots of history. I asked him to teach me, and what he did, by the way, just so you get a sense of what it entailed. You take one photo at the proper exposure, then you overexpose and f-stop and underexpose, so now you have 3. But for these photos, because they were in such different states of disintegration, I did 10 or 12 shots for each photo so that I could get the most out of every image. Some were very thin, some were... And so the mechanics of this were a little bit were a little bit imposing. And in fact, at times, because I had limited time, because I could only be there while Auschwitz was in fact open, I became like a machine, and it didn't really matter what it felt like, or how bent my back was, or how many hours I had been standing and adjusting, and all that mattered was to just do one more and one more. But that is the mechanics. You're talking about something much bigger.
Right. Well, even at that level, you call it mechanistic. You were like a machine. It actually sounds a little different to me than that. It sounds like it sounds the opposite of a machine in some ways. It sounds like a very loving human labor done of devotion, not just out of a kind of numbed, repetitive action. And
it's true, nothing was numbed about this.
Right.
The only part that was mechanistic is I had to keep telling myself that no matter how my body felt,
Right.
I didn't have the luxury of stopping because time mattered, access to this collection. I was there while the communists were in control. I had been prepared ahead of time that I might not ever get access to this room and these photos again. I considered it an act of great fortune that they allowed me in, but I knew that it could be withdrawn at any time.
Right.
So I tried, anyway, so thank you for your honoring the process of copying with the devotion that it took.
No, I say that because I know from my own experience. I know exactly the kind of determination that it takes to see something through. I know how physically difficult photography can be in certain circumstances. And I know the kind of mental state that a person has to be in order to do it with presence and concentration. And I know that it isn't just a mental state, that it's a state of heart as much as it's a state of mind. I know that from my own experience. So
if you're going to do something, maybe anything, but certainly if you're going to do something like this, you have to do it with your whole heart, because it takes everything you have to even embark on a project like this. The photos, Auschwitz did not know who these people were. All they knew is that these are dead Jews.
Right.
I didn't know who these people were.
Right.
All I knew was that they're dead Jews.
Right.
I saw these for a while as archetypes showing what we lost, who we lost,
Right.
who never got a chance to exist. And coming back to, I think, the most important of the questions you asked, what this felt like was like no other job I've ever had. And job is a loose term because it wasn't that somebody was paying me, but no other project, no other endeavor. Other things, if you get worn out, or if you are not big enough for the job, if the endeavor is much bigger than what you can handle, you can pull back and say with some honesty, I'm sorry, I'm just not up to this. For this project, even if there were many times that I felt, this is too big, I'm just one person, I don't know how I will ever do this, especially with no funding, no team, no support, no even group to discuss this with.
Right.
It was a very solitary process. I couldn't stop. And the reason is very simple, and it's one I know you'll understand. Here are people on the cover. Here are people throughout the book. Of course, there was no book yet, there was no cover, there was no even thought of a book. But here are faces looking up at me in a locked archive in a place that people didn't even know existed. This was a room that was not opened. It was opened by accident, and I recognized how big an accident this was, that I even got access to it. But all anybody knew is that these are dead Jews. And when I saw them, and even when I was pushed out of the room after only a few minutes that first time, I couldn't get these photos out of my mind. It isn't that I knew who they were, and it wasn't my aunt. I didn't have an aunt, but it wasn't a relative. It was somebody that had no existence because of the brutality of that war and those people. And when I thought about even the miracle that I had been, by accident, shown those photos, I thought, this is impossible, that it's only me and a few people who worked at Auschwitz that even knew these photos existed. I have to find a way, even if I have no credentials, virtually no money, a single parent of 2 little girls, no real backup in terms of taking care of the children. Nothing that made any sense. But I knew what made even less sense is that only I knew about these photos. I had to find a way that others could have a chance to see them. And it isn't just one direction, others seeing the photos. It's that these photos had to have a chance to have some impact on the world.
Well, I think that what you say, I've heard you say something to this effect before. I heard you say at the Ethics Center. And it's really a powerful aspect of your own story, which is this beginning from a place of humility. I mean, terror and humility at the prospect of being given the responsibility, or even taking the responsibility when no one was asking you to take the responsibility, to do something with this possibility and its implications. And of course now we see that the implications of the work that you've done have spread around the world. They've linked continents, they've linked generations of people, they've linked people that you don't even know are linked. They've reached people whose names you don't know, whose people you'll never meet in your life probably, and the effect and the impact of what you undertook is vast. But once again, just to sort of return to the creative process as maybe a thread, the act of deciding that, the act of first of all even recognizing the problem, and then in the way that you can to begin to confront it and to work your way through it, is a very valuable lesson for creative people, working in all kinds of ways, not just teaching yourself technical skills that you didn't know, but owning up to the problem of the challenges.
And also opening yourself to whatever comes next. The technical skills were the beginning, but the magnitude is the responsibility and the weight of what I felt. I just opened to any page, but so here is one of the photographs. It's a pyramid of girls, and I now know who they are. I now know about their family. I know about her wedding because I met the man who was their best friend, who explained to me he was such a close friend that he arranged her wedding, complete with a klezmer band and the dancing and the best food in town. And he said, I saw them even more than my own family. He explained why and how. But the responsibility when these people are not here to tell their stories is actually both a gift, because you can't stop. How could I stop? And an incredible challenge. I won't even say burden, but I always saw it as an overwhelming challenge, because how could I possibly do enough? How could I possibly tell their stories or even learn their stories?
So can you say a little bit about how you actually went through this passage of understanding them as archetypes, as kind of faceless archetypal figures, and how they moved from that position for you internally within you, how these people moved from that position to begin to acquire name, and to begin to acquire identity, and to begin to acquire dimension and depth. What was this like for you? How did this happen?
Well, first, let me tell you the event that did that. And it's this moment in time when, having never given a speech in my life except to my child's kindergarten, I'm suddenly, and that doesn't qualify you for everything, it qualifies you for a few things, but suddenly I became the United States representative to this important conference in Jerusalem, and I was going to be presenting this discovery. People could not get over, once I started to share it with anybody, how monumental it was that these photos that nobody in the world knew existed, not scholars, not survivors, no one, except for these people who worked at Auschwitz, and they were keeping it closed, they were keeping it locked, they were keeping it secret. That's a whole different story. But I thought, if I, God willing, live through the speech, let me not just start passing out pictures. And so I thought, I'll put it together in a small video montage, and after my remarks, it'll be screened, so people can see the photos themselves. Because what I always wanted is that people, that I don't mediate a reaction, that I don't tell them what to feel, that people feel. And in fact, isn't that the purpose of art in general? That we let people feel, that we arouse something, a reaction, good, bad, but something that makes them think and feel and react.
Yes, I agree with that. But on the other hand, you intensely mediated, I the work that you did came to intensely mediate the photographs, didn't it?
You mean the film that you've seen?
No, I mean the research that you did, and the enormous amount of filling in what we couldn't see in the pictures otherwise.
I see what you mean. Well, I think of mediating as telling people what to feel, not giving them information. So it's just a difference in semantics, I think. Let me consider your question about mediating by filling in. I fill in where I can, because when you look at a photo, I believe you see it on two levels. I really do believe the photo tells its own stories, even when you don't know the name, you don't know the story of that person's life, you don't know about how they lived in context with their family and their society and their profession and their children and their friends, even when you know nothing. I'll just show you this picture. Here is a photo of a bride, and there's a toast. I didn't know so much about the bride except that she was very beautiful, but I did know something about the photographer who took this. Most likely it was not a paid photographer, because somebody paid would have included the husband. Most likely it was somebody who was most concerned about the bride. The husband is sort of an afterthought. He's barely in. They cut his face off. And most likely, if it was a male, he might have been a little smitten by this woman himself. If it was a member of her family, it's clear she's the one who matters. Now I happen to know, because of research and luck, I feel like some of this is so much luck, by the grace of God, accidental, miracles, you call it anything you want. But some of my identifications have come about in such a crazy, non-research kind of way that I don't know what to say. If it happened once or twice, or even 5 times, I'd say, well, this was a lucky break. It's happened almost every time. This woman, by the way, whose name is Rishka, she's toasting, and I didn't know who, because there is an inscription which I didn't have access to. It says L'chaim, which means to life, L'chaim, to our parents. And I didn't know if it meant her parents or his parents. I now know she and her family went to Palestine, pre-state Israel, in the 30s. He, Lolek, had a family who was well known in town, in Bending. They had the most famous stationery store, had lots of people who knew their store and bought all their supplies there. But they were still in Poland. They were not able to come to the wedding. And what we also know, because of that piece of information, is it was his parents who carried this photo into Auschwitz when they were deported there. Let me tell you about the accident that took place when I was in Israel with these photos and the premiere that took place. The night before this big conference, a tiny seconds, just seconds of this montage that I'll screen at Emory. A few seconds were shown the night before as a encouragement, as part of the publicity for the conference on Israeli television. And what I was told is that switchboard lit up like never before. People calling, people desperate to see more photos, people thinking they recognized somebody. There was this flash. Now imagine, they only aired a few seconds. And in my film, there is the tiniest proportion, because I was still at these are archetypes, this is a symbol of what we lost, and I just did this laborious process of under and overexposing, bracketing on 200 photos, which are in that montage. A man came to me after the speech. By the way, they then made me the keynote, which was even worse. And the Prime Minister of Israel, and then me, were opening this conference. There was a huge uproar. Reporters and people at the conference, hundreds of people, were flooding me. And I noticed an old man hobbling and waiting and waiting. And he's the one, and I'll open to the page so you can see which photo he pointed to. He's the one who pointed to this wedding photo, which happened to be one that I had brought with me. Again, luck, luck, luck. And he said, I danced at this wedding. That was the moment when I came to understand. You see, I thought I was finished, having been obsessed with these photos for about 1.5 years. Then I'd go back to my life, I'd go back to my job, I'd go back to some normalcy. But when he said, I danced at this wedding, I realized I was so far from finishing. I had not even started. As it turns out, and we did an incredibly deep interview, his son acting as translator, where he told me about his brother, Emil, his sister-in-law, Jenny, and their little baby. I could have told you where that couple would be on a typical afternoon, which coffee shop, which cinema, how they loved to spend time, what mattered to them. Everything about this couple, and the details, the vibrancy of what the man, Baruch Würzberger, said to me was just unforgettable.
Well, this is very fascinating, because the gap between what it is to see that wedding photograph without that knowledge and what it is to see that wedding photograph after having acquired that knowledge, then is it the same photograph? Is it not the same photograph? Now, I know that And it's a hard, it's an impossible question. It's the same and not the same, maybe.
Exactly. It is and it isn't, but there's yet another layer. I felt if I'm talking to the brother, I'm done. I know.
Uh-huh.
And I only had access to the front of these pictures at this point. It took another few years for me to coordinate, and not so much coordinate, but convince a body that had an organization that had enough funding to try to separate the photos, because you don't want to ruin the photos. And so I got the United States Holocaust Museum involved in helping to separate these photos from, they were pasted in albums, large, like what an ledgers with little pink and blue lines, like what an accountant might use. They were pasted, and thank goodness.
This is the way you found them in the camp. So they had been, I'm not sure I'm following what you're saying. They had been put into album, they had been carried in as single photographs in pockets, and they were put into albums sometime.
Here's what happened.
Later, or
much later. Much later. The people, the Jews who were deported, they were told, we're sending you to work, you're being relocated, bring what you need for a new life. So they brought the tools that they needed to work with, the pots they needed to cook in, children brought their favorite toy, a whole panoply of objects were brought, and the photo they couldn't leave behind, and changes of clothing. And everything was confiscated, everything was organized, everything was saved, but not the photos. There was a secret Nazi edict that said, destroy every one of these personal photographs. So in fact, millions were destroyed. These, as far as anyone knows, in Israel, in the States, in Europe, as far as anyone, any of the historians that I've spoken to knows, this one group of photographs, the photos from one transport, one time, were hidden and saved by members of the Jewish underground. And that's what these are. Well, they weren't just hidden and saved. They came in August, the beginning of August of 1943, hidden through the duration of the war, and Auschwitz was liberated by the Russians at the end of January 45. For a year and a half, these photos were hidden. I have gotten information about who ordered them hidden. I've gotten information about the fact that they were hidden, and other people have verified that they heard about these, other members of the underground that I've interviewed. I don't know where they were hidden. I know the names of a few people who did the hiding. But what wound up, by the way, because I think names are important, let me tell you, a man named David Shmulevitz, who was one of the leaders of the Jewish underground, he said, if we can't save the people, let us at least try to save their memories. And that's when the secret mission, a very courageous group of young kids, teenagers, did the hiding. Because as we know, you could be killed for doing nothing. To do this, it's unimaginable what risk they took. Now, when Auschwitz was liberated, all the people who could still walk, all the people who could still move, were forced out prior to the Russians coming on a death march. So the only people left at Auschwitz were the dead and the dying. I learned by speaking to the Russian Jewish general who liberated Auschwitz, who would only speak Yiddish to me. I learned, I thought perhaps this is so easy. I'll just validate with him. So where did you find the photos? At that moment, by the way, I was in Warsaw speaking to a group of survivors, and it was on the occasion of the liberation of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, not liberation. I wish it had been liberated. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So I was speaking to some survivors who were there in Warsaw, and they are just amazed that such a thing, and these photos, I had just come from Auschwitz. I'm loaded down with a lot of equipment, heavy, heavy equipment, and recording, photographic and recording equipment, and they say, quick, there's somebody in the parade, quick, that you've got to talk to him. So I'm running, I'm not such a big runner, I'm running, I'm lugging all this equipment, and it occurs to me, I don't have any idea who he is. I just see somebody with, I mean, so many badges and what do you call those things?
Medals.
Medals, thank you. Medals, badges are in Scouts. Medals on his chest. As you can see, I'm not so military savvy. And I turn, I'm running now backwards, which you should know is pretty impressive with all that equipment. Running backwards and say, who is he? And that's when they tell me he's the Russian Jewish liberator of Auschwitz. So I'm asking him about these photos that he found. And he looks at me like I'm crazy. He said, you cannot imagine what situation we encountered when we came. So I went from exultation, look at how easy this is, I find the photos, now I'm going to talk to the liberator, he'll tell me the whole story, to despair. What does this mean? He doesn't know anything about it. It took me at least another year to understand that a poor Jew, half dead, is not going to go to the Russian general. He or she would never have imagined such a thing. So the fact that there was somebody still alive who even knew where these were hidden is another miracle. And what they did is they handed them to a foot soldier. The foot soldier in the Russian army took it to the Soviet Union, and years later, in the mid-50s, so about 10 years later, when Auschwitz organized an archive, did these photos come back to Auschwitz? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
I'm sorry, it's a confusing, convoluted story.
I want to ask you about thinking of yourself as an author, not just as a sort of steward of something, but as an author. How you grew into that identity, because you are an author. You're doing more than just you're doing more than and sort of acting on behalf of the vast public. You're creating something, and with regard to that, there are built-in limitations to how far you can go or how far you want to go in terms of recreating something that exists. So when I've read your book very carefully, and there are certain occasions when I want, for example, I want there to be more. Like maybe the symbolic case is the story of Fela Rosen, who is one person who appears in your book. And
I'm going to show you what Fela Rosen looks like. She's quite beautiful. I'd like to also mention, as we're getting to her picture, that virtually every boy, every man that knew her had a crush on Fela.
Right, and so there's the story of her friendship with Russia and
with her best friend Rushka.
Rushka is.
Oops. Where is Rushka?
I think she's maybe a little earlier.
It'd be horrible if I didn't have Rushka's picture in here.
No, she's there. I think she's in before.
Go ahead.
But anyway, the
over here. Thank you. Thank you for showing me my. This is Rushka. They were best friends together, and there's an interesting question that you don't even know was implicit in this. I was lucky enough to meet Rushka's two brothers and her sister. Rushka had died. In fact, she died in her brother's arms after the war in Murano, Italy, from a grotesque beating she took by warning her brother that the Nazis were about to take him. He was passing and pretending to be Aryan, just a Polish prisoner, not a Jewish prisoner. And I heard different versions of the family story. First from the brother, then from the other brother, and it was only when I spoke to the sister who had left Poland before the war with her husband, she was the oldest. When I spoke to Lily, who was then in her almost 90s, it was only then that I heard about this grotesque beating and the letter that Rushka wrote. Other people tried to hide what really happened to Fela, and when I learned the devastation of Fela's life, I struggled. You talk about being an author. I'm an author, but I'm a human being first, and I kept thinking, how far can I go to protect Fela and her reputation, and how far must I go to be honest and be true to what a reader deserves to know? And there's a terrible tension, because people were withholding the truth from me, and when I learned it by accident, I struggled and struggled and struggled, and finally came to the place. I don't think I put the graphic details in because I wanted some respect for the woman, but I put in enough so that I didn't
You mean
hide
that she
the truth.
died by suicide, impoverished, and so forth? Well, I mean, this is part. There are a lot of gaps in the story. There are enticing gaps in her story, and it does also raise the question. You know, these are in light of the horror of the events that killed them. There's sometimes a tendency to flatten the complexity of what they dealt with as people. They were just people after all. They were not perfect people. They were as flawed as every person is. And so there really is this very...
They were everything. They were good people, they weren't good people,
Right.
they were ordinary people, they were
Right.
exceptional people, just like all of us, depending on who you're talking to
Right.
and who you're talking about. There's a lot of variety. And one of the things I've tried not to do is flatten this population. There are many people who just revere everybody and not almost mythologize them. And I think that does as great a service as
It's great a disservice.
as great a I'm sorry, thank you. Mythologizing this population does a great disservice to them, because then we don't talk about who they are as real people. We talk about them as symbols. And when we're able to see them as real people, then we give them the dignity they deserve. We treat them the way they deserve to be treated, even if what we're treating is their story and their photo and their possessions and not them, because we don't have them.
And this goes to a very interesting question about the photographs themselves, which is that these photographs, like family photographs, not in the context of war and genocide, but all kinds of family photographs are often made on certain ritual occasions, happy occasions. They're made in certain occasions and often not in many other occasions. And so, in a sense, they give a particular perspective on the life that was led, but not always a complete perspective.
They give a very positive perspective.
They give a very positive perspective.
Let's not mince words. They don't take it when they're filthy dirty after,
Right.
a hard day of work.
Right.
You don't take it.
Or in the midst of fighting with your husband or whatever. You're not making a photograph at that point, right?
Exactly.
And so how does this... So there's an inbuilt bias in the photographs themselves.
Well, there is and there isn't, because I draw a big distinction between the studio photographs
Yes, right.
and
Mhm.
the snapshots. The studio, and even snapshots are taken, on a vacation, at a birthday party. They're not in the midst of the argument or the, filthy with mud because you've just fallen. Studio portraits, if you ask me to talk about studio portraits, I would say they show us the way life was supposed to be. In fact, here is one of the greatest that could illustrate this point. It's the one that I used to open the whole section. The book is divided, by the way, into two parts. The general photos in the beginning, and then the family photos. This is the one that I used to open family. I don't know who they are, but if ever there was a studied portrait of what they're proud of, this family where the wife's collar is made of fur, the husband's watch chain is the thickest fob that I've ever seen, and they look proud and happy. But of course, the greatest thing that they're proud and happy of, proud of and happy about, are their two children, who remarkably look like each parent. One looks just like the mother, one looks just like the father. By the way, when you spoke about people that I never know, relating to these photos, somebody in Paris, a woman, wrote to me and said, I know this family. Somebody survived and they were related to one of the daughters. I was absolutely ecstatic. And she sent me photos to prove that this, and then she had so much information from the daughter, then who the daughter married, and then the daughter's children. And I had an amazing experience until I saw the photo. And it was very sad for me. I don't know that I told her that I didn't agree with her, but it was very sad for me to discover that the photo she felt was a dead ringer for one of these children. You had to go on faith that that's who it is, because you wouldn't do it based on characteristics, physical characteristics.
Right.
But, so this is...
Which, by the way, opens a door into a conversation we don't have time to have, which is how it is that I'm a person steeped in photography, and I often find it very difficult to confirm the identity of two images being of the same person, because photography is so peculiar and things change.
That's right.
Appearances are so particular in photographs that the act of actually positively identifying people in photographs is very vexed. And this is another subject I'd like sometime to be able to talk with you about.
But Jason, I feel like that's where I can talk a little bit more with you. And I'll just say, the head Hillel was asked, how do you define all of Judaism standing on one foot? So if he could do that on one foot, which is to treat other people the way you want to be treated, and I think that's the crux of all the great religions.
But don't forget the rest of what he said, though, which is to me just as important. He said, the rest is commentary, but I suggest you study the commentary.
Right, the rest is commentary. And he validated that you should learn it. When I was faced with 2,400 photographs, at the end, when I'd been back to Poland a number of times and ultimately succeeded in copying every single one, then I'm still left with photos photos of people about whom we knew nothing. And the way Auschwitz, by the way, in this archive, pasted them in, they're pasted the way a stranger would put them in. We were talking about family albums where great moments or happy moments or significant moments are recorded. Take it another level. In a family album, it's sequential. What happened last week is on the last page. What happened 3 years ago was on an earlier page. In Auschwitz, these ledger books, which were organized by the archive department, so strangers were organizing photos of strangers. So all the wedding photos were together, all the baby photos were together, all the portraits made in studios were together, all the snapshots were together, school pictures, you get the idea. When I finally had these thousands of pictures where I knew nothing, because don't forget, at this point, I still had no access to the back. I could only photograph the fronts. What I came to do, and when you're looking at thousands of faces, you become familiar with a set of eyes, familiar with a hairline, and I could start to group them. I may not have known who it is, but I knew they have to be a member of this family, and it's only years later when I finally meet somebody with luck that things can be validated.
Right. Well, one of the most mercurial parts about all of photography to me is that the same group of photographs arranged in a different order or in a different configuration can mean something remarkably different. And I guess that's exactly what you've shown by taking those ledger albums and transposing them through time and devoted research, transposing them into something different. Now, I mean, there's a famous quotation that I'm thinking, it's been in my mind the whole time we've been talking, by Roland Barthes, who said that a photograph is a living object of a dead thing.
Oh,
and
he's so incredible.
Yeah.
I didn't know that photo. I love his work.
And you know, in a way, you have recreated livingness from livingness. That has happened, and that's, or it's begun to happen, I suppose, because it's not finished, and as you know, there's a lot of work left to do, and, even after all this time.
When you talk about creating livingness from something that is flat on a page, but it symbolizes a life that didn't get to be lived. The fact that you can see that actually makes me filled with such gratitude, because it means that, you know, I've spent a quarter of a century, in October, almost a quarter of a century, it'll be 24 years. If you had spoken to me in the late 80s or mid 80s and said, you're going to spend the next 20, 24, 25 years, you're going to spend until you die doing this, I would have said, not in your life.
Right.
I have a life.
Right.
I have a different career. I have things I'm doing.
Right.
It would be inconceivable, and yet the photos and the lives behind these photographs and the search to bring their lives into some kind of focus, and even to know that there was a life, not just the brutality of those images that the Nazis have implanted. I mean, the photos that we mostly have in our minds are the dehumanized photos
Yes.
of how the Nazis took everything away from these people.
Right.
Everything they had, not just everything they owned, but even every sense of themselves, right down to their names being transformed into numbers. And then ultimately took their lives. As James Young, who wrote the opening to the book, talks about, those brutal images are what the Nazis created. The hair without the people, the spectacles without the eyes, the limbs, prosthetic limbs without the bodies that they were supposed to help, the rings without the fingers they're supposed to be around. As he says, this is a disembodied view. And he talks about how what I did in this book, or with this effort, not just a book, with every time I try to show a face, a story of a life, a pair of eyes. He says, what you've done, Anne, is reanimate these people. Not bones, not blood, but vibrancy of life. One of the things that the survivors thank me for, and I can't tell you how amazing their comments have been, their gratitude is that you show us the way we were. One survivor, when I got off the stage, an old woman came to me. Her hands were gnarled. I never met almost, her skin was almost translucent. All you could see were the veins. And I came to her because I didn't want her to be jostled by all these people around her. And she said, I had to wait to touch your hand that does this holy work, and to thank you. I've thought of that woman many times because the work that we're doing, you and me and all the others who are dealing with images and a history that rips your heart out. I think about what she said as a way to continue when I get tired, when I feel hopeless, when I don't know how much longer I can do this because of what it takes, what it means, what I give up. I don't mean to say this in a way that sounds, what I mean is I gave up everything except my children. The children I wouldn't give up. But any security in a job, any kind of bank account, any kind of normalcy, because I felt so privileged. I do feel so privileged to be able to have the chance to do what these photos and the people need me to do. Restore something of their humanity. And now, here's the question you didn't ask. Why does this matter? The truth is, I really don't matter. But the fact that I'm able to bring these to you, to people here, to people all over the world, that does matter. And it matters because of what they say. They have said to me again and again, here are the two comments I hear. The first is always about a different photograph. I'll point to this because this is one of them. This brother kissing a sister. Well, a woman in Baltimore, Marcia, said to me, I have the same picture in our album. The comment that I hear more than any other is, and it's about any one of these pictures, this looks just like something in my own family album.
Right.
So people where they can't relate to dehumanization in the photos we're so familiar with, where these skeletal images, whether they're dead or alive, where that has nothing to do with most people, nobody, and they can distance from those, nobody can distance from these pictures of life the way it was when the world was still innocent. So one is to personalize a history that's so hard to personalize. But the second reason that it matters to me to continue is because people have said again and again how this changes the way they live. And being a bit of a, I don't like hyperbole. I want real truth, and I don't want people just to say some things because it sounds nice. I challenge them and I say, what do you mean?
Mm-hmm.
How is your life really changed because you have heard a story I told,
Mm-hmm.
seen a photo I pulled out of that place?
And what's the answer?
The answer is simple. Your photos, your stories, your anything, whatever they were exposed to, the film, the book, the exhibition, the answer that I get more than any other is looking at these pictures of life in its vibrancy, normal life, photos that look just like us, your photos, because these are people who were murdered or who they loved and brought the photo, that person. Your photos teach us to appreciate life. Your photos have taught me to go tell the people I love how much I love them. Your photos have taught me how precious every minute we have is. And then I try to link memory to action because I think it's not enough just to remember. I want there to be some involvement. I want people who see these photos and who care and whose hearts are open to look around and see who around us needs help and not to look away. Because I feel these photos, these sacred photos, the ones that people could not be without, the ones they couldn't leave behind, the ones they cherished more than any other image, these photos are still teaching us to look, to see, to care, and to help. It's quite an achievement for people who've been dead for more than 60 years.
Well, thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you. What a privilege to be talking to you.
Likewise. Likewise.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.